Hello, I'm Greg Greenwood, and I'm going to be presenting a series of videos demonstrating the basic jewelry and metalsmithing techniques used in jewelry making. The first video, we're going to concentrate on forging or hammering of sterling silver wires. There's various techniques that we'll be learning, and I'm going to start from the very basics and show you what the tools will be that we'll be using and how they work, what we'll be forging on, what happens to the wires when we start hammering on them. And so let's start with the basics. This is a forging hammer. This is a 2-pound forging hammer. The head here has got two sides of it. They're called peens. You'll notice that the flat peen is a mirror finish. We want to make sure that a mirror finish is on the hammers, so when we start hammering on the sterling silver wire, if there's nicks and gouges in here, those will be transferred onto the wire, so we don't want to do that. Then we have to get those out. And then same thing on the cross peen. We want to make sure that it's nice and smooth, so when we're hammering on those wires, we won't be leaving blemishes on them. And what happens when you start hammering a metal is that the metal will start spreading in different directions according to the type of hammer that you're going to be using. With this forging hammer, if we use the flat peen, the metal actually starts spreading in all different directions, evenly in all different directions. If you use the cross peen, the majority of the metal will start moving in this direction and this direction, and not normally to the sides. So we can use this to our advantage to make sure that we make the metal go where we want to, how wide we want the wires to be, and make various thicknesses in the wires. We also want to hammer or forge on something that's going to be solid, that's going to be relatively smooth too, and so we can make sure that we're squeezing or hammering that metal to the width that we want. We're not going to be using a hammer on a wooden bench as the wood starts giving away, so we're going to be using an anvil. This is an anvil that we'll be using for forging. And you'll notice that I have it in a box here on the floor, and it has sand in it. This will keep the anvil from ringing when we're hammering on it and keeps it much, much quieter. The type of wire that we're going to be using today for the demonstration is sterling silver. This is some examples of sterling silver wire. It comes in different sizes and shapes. Square and round are the most common, and we'll be using square sterling silver wire today. This is called a bench pin. You can see that I've used it quite extensively and sawn into it, drilled into it, and so on. But this is we'll call it a bench pin, and it will help me hold the piece of silver in the position that I want to file. This is the file that I'm going to be using. It's just a simple flat file, and so there's teeth in here, and they only work in one direction when you start pushing the file away from you. So we do not want to take and scrub the metal. We want to be taking and forcing the file away from us, and that will start smoothing out any of the rough edges. So I'm going to put the piece of metal on the end of the bench pin and start forcing the file across the end of the wire until that becomes smooth. Before we start forging on the wires, we want to make sure that they're completely prepared for forging. We've already filed the ends of the wires, so when we start hammering on them or forging them, they won't split. Also, we have to prepare the molecules of the sterling silver for forging. What happens with these molecules, they're compacted and they're really tight together. When you start hammering on the metal, it actually takes those molecules and forces them closer and closer together. And the metal becomes really hard and really hard to bend, or also even to forge, because those molecules are so close together they don't want to spread out and move with our hammer blows. So what we want to do is we want to prepare those molecules and get them as far apart as possible so the metal will be as soft as possible. And so when we start hammering on them, we're going to force those molecules closer together and it will become really, really hard. So let's get those molecules as far apart as possible. So how do we do this? We'll be doing this by heating the sterling silver to a certain color, and which makes those molecules start bumping into each other when they start heating up and they start expanding and moving apart. And then when we get them as far apart as possible before the metal melts or those molecules get far apart and they lose their shape, we're going to cut the temperature and keep those molecules as far apart as possible. So let's do that by heating the sterling silver, and we'll be using an acetylene torch, which is an acetylene and air mixture. And I'm going to be heating them on a bed of pumice rock. You notice that it's just starting to turn maybe kind of yellows and then kind of orange and then this dull cherry red color. See that dull cherry red? We don't want to take it any hotter than that because then the metal will start melting. Now you'll notice also in this wire it is turned from kind of that white silvery color to a dark gray or a black. What happens with the sterling silver when you heat it, it oxidizes, or when we think of steel, we think of rust. Well, this rusts or oxidizes and it turns dark gray or black. Now we'll take that piece of silver that's been heated up to a dull cherry red, and by the way, this process is called annealing. So the annealing process will take those molecules, make them bump into each other, get them as far apart as possible. Then we cut the temperature at the dull cherry red color, and then those molecules will stay far apart. With this oxide layer on here, we want to get that cleaned off, and we simply drop that into an acid solution. Okay, let's take that piece of silver out of here. And you notice now, instead of black, it's kind of a white color. This is the fine silver that's been left on the surface. The oxides have been removed, and so it's pure silver on the surface. I'm going to drop it into a solution of baking soda and water. This neutralizes the acid, and then rinse it in good, clean, fresh water. So now our piece of sterling silver is ready to forge. Now we're ready to forge the sterling silver wire. I've got it on the anvil. I've got my forging hammer with my cross peen, and I'm going to be wanting to widen this wire and make it fatter at one end and then taper on down to about the middle of the wire. So I want to make it kind of in a V shape. So I'm going to be taking the cross peen and start hammering across the wire this way. I want to try to hit it right in the middle of the wire so it'll start spreading those molecules out and making the wire fatter. You notice that it's starting to get a little bit fatter or wider. So I'm going to flip it over so we make sure that we get an even spread on the wire. Try to keep hammering in the middle of the wire. If I get too close to the edges, it will start folding over here, and then we'll have to file all that extra off. So I want to make sure that I try to forge right smack dab in the middle of the wire and make it wider here at the end and taper it back into about the middle. So I'll do a little bit more forging, but you notice the hammer marks on that wire, and so eventually we want to get those out of there. So let's do a little bit more forging with the cross peen. Make it a little bit wider. Okay, so now you'll see those hammer marks on there. So let's use the other side of the forging hammer, the flat peen, and hammer it and see if we can smooth those out. I'd rather smooth them out with a hammer than try to file them and polish them all up and waste the silver. So let's just hammer those marks out, overlapping those hammer blows with that nice smooth surface of the forging hammer. Flip it on over. Some more on this side. Flip it back. Just kind of overlap my hammer blows. This is called planishing. So you'll notice that now that is much, much smoother there. There's still a few little marks in it, but the major hammer blows from the cross peen are gone and it's much smoother. Now what has happened when we've been hammering on this or forging it, those molecules in this half right here have gotten a lot closer together. So this side is really brittle and hard compared to the annealed side over here, which is still relatively soft because we've heated it up and annealed it to the dull cherry red color. So now, if I wanted to do any bending on this wire, I would have to anneal it again to soften it up so I can actually bend it, because this is very, very, very hard right now to bend. So let's take this wire and do something with it. The whole idea of forging and changing what we call reverses or planes on the wire is to give it visual interest. If you just take a round or a square wire, it's kind of dull and boring. So if we do the forging on it and taper it, and then all of a sudden we have this flat surface here on this side, and then we flip it over and do a flat surface on the other side and reverse those planes, it will make the wire much, much more interesting and make more interesting jewelry. So let's just flip this wire around and let's forge the other end of it here, but let's forge it on the opposite plane. So we're going to reverse that plane. We'll use the same techniques using the cross peen, flip it over, do a little bit more on the back. I'm going to take and planish it with the flat peen. Kind of overlap my hammer blows, and you'll be able to see all those marks of the cross peen remove. So now here we have what we call a simple reverse plane, where it's flat on one side and then flips over and then it's flat on the opposite side. So that's called a simple reverse or a reverse plane. Now that we have that forged on both ends and have that reverse plane, the edges, because of the simple forging method, will make these a little bit rough, and I want to get those a little bit smoother. And the very tips of the wires, because of the hammering, we want to smooth those off also. So the easiest way to do that is to simply file those edges down. Any little blemishes from the hammer will be taken out, and then I'm going to just round off these edges right at the very end, just to make it look a little bit nicer. Turn it over, do the same thing here, because I'm using my flat end of the file now. Turn the wire over, we'll do the same thing. Okay, now we have our forged wire forged in a simple reverse, file the edges so they're smooth, and now we may want to bend this and make it into a piece that could be used in a piece of jewelry. So because we've hammered that, remember the forging takes those molecules and makes them closer together, which makes the metal really hard. It's called work hardening. And so we've work hardened this metal, and so now it's very, very difficult to bend. So how do we soften it? We take and we anneal it, or heat it up, get those molecules bumping into each other, get them far apart, and make the metal soft. So let's take this wire, and as you can see, it's straight and not too terribly exciting. So let's take it and start putting some curves to it, add a little bit more three-dimensional interest. And I could go ahead and just take my fingers and push down, but still it's pretty tough metal, fairly thick metal, and it's not going to bend very easily, but we have annealed it so it's nice and soft. So what I can do is I can bend it over this T-stake, and I can use a rawhide mallet. Now, unlike the forging hammer, it's not steel. It's a rolled rawhide, kind of like a chew stick for a dog. But these have been used for many, many years for hammering on metal to not leave any marks on the metal like the planishing hammer or the forging hammer would. So it will help bend the metal without leaving marks on it. So I'm going to put it on the T-stake and start hammering just over the edge and start curving it around the edge. So I'm simply taking it and bending it over the edge of the T-stake with the rawhide mallet. Now, hey, let's take this other side and we'll bend it with the forge also. And we'll make it more three-dimensional. So now we have a really unique piece of metal that has some visual interest to it and a little bit more three-dimensional quality. Now that we have that forged wire forged in a simple reverse and bent in some curves, let's see if we can even make it bend more and maybe put a curl into it. So now that I've hammered on it, I've worked hardened that piece of metal again. So now those molecules are close together and that piece of metal is fairly stiff. So I'm going to re-anneal it, and then let's use some pliers to bend it around a little bit more. Now I've already annealed this forged wire, and we have those curves on it from the T-stake and the rawhide mallet. But I would like to take this side and maybe curve it around a little bit more. So I can use a pair of pliers. These are round nose pliers. And I have to be real careful on this, because if I grab them with the steel pliers and start putting some force on the wire, it will make an indentation. So I have to be real careful. Sometimes I'll put masking tape or painter's tape on the pliers themselves, and that will cushion them. And I'm simply going to grab them at the end and give it a little twist. Okay, that gave it a real nice curl at the end. And then this plane here has been forged, and then it curls around and then reverses planes, and that really leaves the piece of metal much more interesting than what we had with the square wire. Now that we've gone through the process of forging and taking our simple square sterling silver wire and putting reverses on it and bend it into more of a three-dimensional shape, we'd like to start doing something with the metal. So obviously we want to make a piece of jewelry. So in the next video, I'd like to show you how to solder. Solder is a fascinating technique in jewelry making, and one of the most important, because you have to put pieces of metal or fabricate them together to make that jewelry. You can't normally just have one piece of metal and that's it. So we'll be going through the process of soldering, and the techniques. I'll show you several different techniques for soldering, and we'll get right down again to the very basics. We'll be taking our three-dimensional piece, and I'll probably make some more pieces to put with it so we can do some soldering, and we'll go through the whole process. It'll be lots of fun, really very fascinating and interesting. So looking forward to the next video. And thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. I hope you learned something. See you next time.